A car door creaks open into the darkness. 5 gunshots. Then silence. A 16-year-old girl is running, barefoot on gravel, blood soaking through the back of her jacket. And she doesn't make it far. This is not the beginning of a mystery. This is the beginning of a manhunt that would last more than 50 years. And is still not over. 2 teenagers, 1 first date. And a killer who would soon give himself a name that would terrify an entire state. A name police still can't put a face to. Before there was a mask. Before there were ciphers, taunting letters, or nicknames splashed across every newspaper in California. There was just a boy and a girl, parked on a quiet road, who never made it home. What happened to them in less than 2 minutes would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers, some of whom died still trying to solve it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this single, brutal night on a forgotten stretch of road gave birth to one of the most notorious unsolved cases in American history. The Zodiac killer. Stay till the end, because the answer to who did this is still being fought over today. Comment below, what country are you watching from? And hit subscribe. This channel covers real, deeply researched cold cases every week. To understand what was lost on Lake Herman Road, you have to understand who David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen actually were, not just names in a case file, but 2 ordinary teenagers at the very start of something. David Faraday was 17. He was the kind of kid parents pointed to as an example. A Boy Scout, a solid student, well-mannered, the type who held doors open and said, "Yes, ma'am." According to people who knew him, David wasn't afraid to stand up for what he thought was right. There's a story, one that would later become strangely significant, that he'd once confronted a man he believed was dealing drugs near his school and threatened to report him to the police. At 17, that takes a certain kind of nerve. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, an honor student at Hogan High School. She'd moved to California from Colorado, and by every account, she was bright, well-liked, and a good daughter, the kind of girl who kept her promises to her parents. The 2 of them had met only 2 weeks earlier at a church function. It wasn't a whirlwind romance in the dramatic sense. It was something smaller and more innocent than that. They liked each other. David had started cutting class just to spend time with her. And on the night of December 20th, 1968, they were finally going on their first official date. Betty Lou's parents watched from the doorway as David pulled up in his mother's Rambler station wagon. There was a plan, a Christmas concert at Hogan High, just a few blocks from the Jensen home. Betty Lou had told her mother and father she'd be back by 11 p.m. It was a small, ordinary promise. The kind teenagers make every single day. Neither of them had any idea it was a promise they would never get the chance to keep. Because somewhere between that doorway and 11 p.m., their plans changed. A stop with a friend, a quick visit to a local restaurant. Small detours that, in hindsight, feel almost unbearable to imagine. Because every minute that passed was a minute closer to a turnout on a dark, empty road that neither of them would leave alive. 2 ordinary teenagers, 1 first date. No warning at all of what was waiting for them in the dark. By roughly 10:15 p.m., David and Betty Lou had abandoned the concert plan altogether. Maybe they wanted privacy. Maybe they just wanted to talk. Whatever the reason, David turned the Rambler off the main road and onto Lake Herman Road, a narrow, isolated stretch connecting Benicia and Vallejo, well known locally as a lover's lane. It was quiet, secluded, the kind of place where a teenage couple could sit and talk without anyone watching. David pulled into a gravel turnout near a water pumping station and parked. For a while, nothing happened. Just 2 teenagers sitting in a parked car on what should have been a completely unremarkable night. But they weren't as alone as they thought. At some point before 11 p.m., another car arrived on that same stretch of road. It's not clear exactly when the driver first noticed the Rambler, or how long he watched before making his move. What we do know, pieced together later from witness statements and crime scene evidence, is that the second vehicle eventually pulled up close behind them. A witness, driving past around this time, would later tell police they'd seen a car parked next to Faraday's station wagon. At the time, it meant nothing. Just another car on a lover's lane road. Nobody thought twice about it. Ask yourself, how many times have you passed a stranger in a car and thought absolutely nothing of it? That's exactly what makes this moment so quietly terrifying. Somewhere in that 10 to 15 minute window, a man got out of his vehicle and walked toward 2 teenagers who had no idea he existed. There was no locked door that could have stopped what came next. No warning shot fired into the air as a bluff. Just a man on foot, closing the distance in the dark, while David and Betty Lou sat inside the car, completely unaware that the next few minutes would be their last. By 11:10 p.m., at least one witness would later report having seen the couple still sitting on Lake Herman Road. They were alive. They were fine. 10 minutes later, they wouldn't be. What happened in that gap, what was said, if anything was said at all, is something only one person on Earth has ever known the full truth of. And to this day, that person has never been forced to answer for it. Here is what the evidence tells us. A man approached the Rambler on foot. At some point, he ordered David and Betty Lou out of the car. They didn't comply immediately. A shot was fired. Not into the couple, but into the vehicle itself, likely meant to force them to move. It worked. Betty Lou exited first, through the front passenger door. David followed. Then the shooting began for real. David was shot once, a single bullet above his left ear. He collapsed almost immediately just outside the passenger door of his mother's car. Betty Lou ran. She made it roughly 28 feet from the rear of the Rambler before she was shot 5 times in the back. The wounds clustered tightly together on her right side, meaning the shots were fired at close. Controlled range, not wildly, not in panic. 2 additional shots struck her from the front. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The gunman got back in his car. And he drove away. From the moment he stepped out of his vehicle to the moment he left, the entire attack likely lasted somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes. 2 lives ended in less time than it takes to boil an egg. David Faraday was still breathing when he was found. Witnesses who arrived shortly after would later describe seeing his breath rising into the cold night air. A small, devastating detail that made the scene feel less like a crime report and more like a person dying in real time. He didn't survive the drive to the hospital. Betty Lou was already gone by the time anyone reached her. There was no struggle beyond those first few seconds. No prolonged chase. No warning that gave them any real chance to escape. Just a stranger, a gun, and 2 teenagers who had done nothing except park on a quiet road for their very first date. This is the moment that, 7 months later, investigators would look back on and realize wasn't a random act of violence at all. It was a rehearsal, a first performance from a man who was just getting started. But on the night of December 20th, 1968, nobody knew that yet. All anyone knew was that 2 kids from Vallejo were dead, and nobody had the faintest idea why. A little after 11 p.m., a woman named Stella Borges was driving east along Lake Herman Road when her headlights caught something on the ground near the pumping station turnout. 2 bodies. She stopped, and she called it in. Among the first officers to respond was Benicia Detective Pierre Bidot. He had, by pure coincidence, driven past that exact stretch of road only minutes earlier and had seen nothing. Nothing at all. When he returned, everything had changed. He found David Faraday lying just outside the passenger door of the station wagon, a gunshot wound visible above his ear. Faraday was still alive. Bidot would later describe, in a 2007 documentary, watching the young man's breath rise into the cold air, one of those small, haunting human details that never makes it into an official police report, but never leaves the people who witnessed it. Faraday died before reaching Vallejo General Hospital. Betty Lou Jensen's body was found roughly 28 feet behind the vehicle, face and hair matted with blood. She was already gone. Word spread through Vallejo and Benicia almost immediately. 2 teenagers, good kids, known in their community, gunned down for seemingly no reason, on a road countless local couples had parked on for decades without incident. There was no obvious robbery. Nothing was stolen. No sign of a struggle beyond the shooting itself. It didn't fit any pattern investigators recognized. Parents in both towns were terrified. If it could happen to David and Betty Lou, an honor student and a Boy Scout, on their very first date, it could happen to anyone's child. Nobody in Benicia that night had any concept of what this crime was about to become. To them, it was a horrifying, senseless double murder. A tragedy. A mystery, certainly, but a local one. They had no way of knowing they had just witnessed the opening scene of a story that would consume the entire state of California for the next 5 years, and captivate the world for decades after that. In the immediate aftermath, investigators reached for the most logical explanations available to them. The first theory was simple. This was a robbery gone wrong, or an assault by someone who'd stumbled across a parked couple and acted on impulse. Lovers' lanes, unfortunately, weren't unheard of targets for opportunistic violence, but nothing was taken. No wallets, no jewelry. The motive, if there was one, wasn't financial. The second theory dug into David Faraday's own life. Remember the story about David confronting a suspected drug dealer near his school? Investigators took it seriously. Was this retaliation? A warning that had gone catastrophically further than intended? Detectives spent real time chasing this angle, interviewing classmates, following rumors about a man from a pancake house on Tennessee Street who had allegedly been threatened by Faraday. It went nowhere solid. A third theory considered whether Betty Lou or David had a jealous ex, a jilted admirer, someone with a personal grudge. Teenagers talk, and in a town the size of Vallejo, rumors move fast. Investigators worked through those leads too. None of them held up. What made this case so disorienting for 1968-era investigators wasn't a lack of evidence. They had shell casings, tire patterns, and a rough physical description from a passing witness. What they lacked was a reason. Every murder they'd worked before had a motive they could hunt down. Jealousy, money, revenge. This one had none of that. It looked chillingly like violence for its own sake. For 7 months, the Lake Herman Road case sat unsolved, filed away as a tragic, senseless anomaly. A cold case before cold cases were even a widely used term. Nobody, not the police, not the grieving families, not the town of Benicia, had any reason to believe this was only the first chapter of something much bigger. That belief was about to be shattered. 7 months later, on the night of July 4th, 1969, a gunman opened fire on another young couple, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park. Just a few miles from Lake Herman Road, Darlene Farron was killed. Her friend, Michael Mojo, survived, shot in the leg, neck, and jaw, but alive enough to describe what happened. When ballistics experts examined the shell casings from Blue Rock Springs, they found something that changed everything. The gun used matched the one that had killed David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen 7 months earlier. This wasn't two unrelated tragedies. This was the same person, and he wanted people to know it. Weeks later, letters began arriving at Bay Area newspapers. The San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Examiner, written by someone claiming responsibility for both attacks. He included details about the crimes that hadn't been made public. He signed his letters with a crossed circle symbol, and he gave himself a name, Zodiac. Go back for a moment to that quiet gravel turnout on Lake Herman Road. Remember David, still breathing in the cold air. Remember Betty Lou, 28 feet from the car. At the time, it looked like an isolated, senseless act. Now you know what those investigating it in 1968 didn't. It wasn't isolated at all. It was the beginning. The man who fired those shots on December 20th wasn't finished. He was only getting started. And over the next several years, he would go on to claim responsibility for multiple additional attacks. Taunt police directly through his letters. Include ciphers he dared investigators to crack, and become one of the most infamous unidentified killers in American history. 2. Teenagers on their very first date had unknowingly become the opening chapter of a story that would grip the country for the next 5 years and remain unsolved for more than 50. Every piece of evidence gathered on that cold December night. The shell casings, the witness statement about a second car, the tire patterns near the turnout, instantly took on a new weight. This wasn't just a murder file anymore. It was the first page of the Zodiac's story. Let's slow down and look at exactly what investigators actually had to work with. Because piecing together the Zodiac's earliest crime meant working almost entirely from physical fragments. Piece 1, the shell casings. Recovered near the Rambler, they confirmed a .22 caliber weapon was used. On its own, that told investigators very little. .22s were common. But once matched to Blue Rock Springs 7 months later, those same casings became the single strongest physical link tying the two crimes to one shooter. Piece 2, the vehicle position. Faraday's Rambler was parked facing east, near the entrance to the pumping station. The positioning, combined with the location of the shots, allowed investigators to reconstruct the couple's likely movements in their final moments. Betty Lou exiting first, David following, both moving away from the car as the shooting continued. Piece 3, the witness sighting. A driver passing the turnout reported seeing a second vehicle parked near the Rambler around the time of the attack. This is one of the most tantalizing and frustrating pieces of evidence in the entire case. It confirms the killer likely arrived by car and waited or followed the couple to the location, but the description was vague, not enough to identify a suspect. Enough only to confirm he was there. Piece 4, the timing window. Witnesses placed the couple alive on Lake Herman Road as late as 11:10 p.m. Stella Borges. discovered the bodies shortly after 11 p.m. by some accounts, meaning the entire attack occurred inside an extraordinarily narrow window, reinforcing just how fast and deliberate the killer's actions were. Piece 5. The drug dealer rumor. Investigators pursued this seriously for months, chasing a story involving a confrontation at a local restaurant. It was a real documented lead, but it never connected to anything solid, and, in hindsight, almost certainly had nothing to do with what actually happened. Individually, none of these pieces answered the question everyone wanted answered. Who did this? But together, they built something crucial, a forensic and behavioral profile that would, 7 months later, allow investigators to definitively link this crime to Blue Rock Springs, and later to additional attacks throughout the Bay Area. In cold case investigation, sometimes the breakthrough isn't a single dramatic discovery. Sometimes it's simply enough small pieces, held onto long enough, until one new piece of evidence finally makes them all click into place. For the Zodiac case, that click happened on July 4th, 1969, and once it did, there was no going back. What followed the Blue Rock Springs connection was not a swift resolution. It was decades. Throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the Zodiac case consumed detectives, journalists, and amateur investigators alike. Task forces were formed across multiple jurisdictions: Vallejo, San Francisco, Napa, because the killer struck in more than one location, complicating who technically had authority over the case. Letters kept arriving. Some contained cryptic ciphers, some of which took literal decades to solve. One wasn't cracked until 2020, more than 50 years after it was mailed. Others were later dismissed as hoaxes, muddying an already difficult investigation with false leads that consumed valuable time and resources. Detectives assigned to the case, most famously SFPD Inspector Dave Toschi, became personally consumed by it. Toschi worked the Zodiac case for years, chasing leads that repeatedly dissolved under scrutiny. The psychological toll on investigators like him was real. A case with this much public attention, this much evidence, and still no resolution, has a way of following a detective home. Every few years, a promising new lead would surface. A handwriting match, a partial fingerprint, a witness who suddenly remembered a new detail. And every time the trail would eventually go cold again, ask yourself, what does it do to a person to spend years, sometimes an entire career, chasing someone they can never quite catch? For the investigators who worked this case across 4 decades, that wasn't a rhetorical question. It was daily reality. Meanwhile, the case seeped into popular culture in a way almost no other unsolved crime has. Books were written. Theories multiplied. Amateur sleuths across the country pored over the ciphers, convinced they'd found the answer no professional investigator ever had. And still, no arrest. No trial. No confirmed name. For David Faraday's and Betty Lou Jensen's families, this meant something particularly painful. The murder of their children had become a piece of pop culture. Discussed, dramatized, debated by strangers online, while the fundamental question of who did this remained completely unanswered. That's a specific kind of grief. Not just losing someone, but watching their death become a puzzle for the world to solve without ever actually being solved. If there's one name most associated with the Zodiac investigation outside of Zodiac itself, it's Arthur Lee Allen. Nearly a decade after the Lake Herman Road murders, Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist working at the San Francisco Chronicle, began developing his own theory about the killer's identity while working on what would eventually become his book, Zodiac. After conferring with Inspector Toschi, Graysmith zeroed in on Allen as his primary suspect. Allen fit certain circumstantial criteria. He'd known some of the individuals connected to the case. Handwriting analysis produced mixed, inconclusive results. Some experts saw similarities to the Zodiac's letters, others firmly did not. He was investigated multiple times over the years. Searches were conducted. DNA testing was eventually attempted decades later on physical evidence connected to Allen. None of it produced a conclusive match. Allen died in 1992, having never been formally charged. To this day, there remains genuine, unresolved disagreement among investigators and researchers about whether he was actually the Zodiac or simply the most heavily publicized suspect, thanks largely to Graysmith's book and the 2007 film it inspired. More recently, in 2021, a group calling themselves the Casebreakers, a collection of retired law enforcement officials and amateur researchers, publicly named a different suspect, Gary Francis Post, a man they claimed matched physical and circumstantial details from the case. It's important to be direct here. This claim has not been verified by official law enforcement agencies, and no formal charges have ever resulted from it. Multiple outlets and researchers have raised significant doubts about the evidence presented. This is, honestly, the defining frustration of the entire Zodiac case. Over 5 decades, dozens of names have been floated, some by credentialed investigators, others by amateur researchers who became just as consumed by the mystery as the original detectives. Each new name generates headlines. Each one eventually fails to produce the one thing that actually matters: definitive, court-standard proof. So where does that leave us? With a case file full of circumstantial threads, contested handwriting analysis, inconclusive DNA results, and passionate disagreement, but without a name that has ever been confirmed beyond reasonable doubt by an actual court of law, it's uncomfortable. It's unsatisfying, but it's the truth. And it's exactly what makes this case different from most others you'll find on this channel. There is no tidy ending here. Only decades of people trying, genuinely, obsessively trying, to find one. In recent years, the same forensic tools that have cracked open dozens of other decades-old cold cases, touched DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, have been applied to Zodiac evidence. Genetic genealogy, for context, is the technique that famously identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, decades after his crimes. It works by comparing crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases, building out family trees until investigators can narrow a suspect pool down to a single individual. For the Zodiac case, investigators and independent researchers have attempted similar techniques using DNA recovered from the backs of stamps and envelope flaps on the killer's letters, physical evidence that, unlike the original 1968 crime scene, still exists and can theoretically be tested with modern methods unavailable in the 1960s and 70s. The results, so far, have been inconclusive. Decades of handling by postal workers, lab technicians, and multiple generations of investigators have compromised much of the potential DNA evidence. Some partial profiles have been developed. None have led to a confirmed, court-admissible identification. This is, in some ways, the most quietly tragic part of the modern chapter of this story. The tools exist now. The techniques that have solved cases just as old or older than this one are available. And still, the specific combination of degraded evidence, decades of contamination, and the sheer public attention the case has attracted has kept a confirmed answer just out of reach. Vallejo Police Department and the FBI have both confirmed, as recently as recent years, that the Zodiac case remains officially open. Tips are still submitted. Evidence is still occasionally re-examined with newer technology as it becomes available, which raises a genuinely open question. One true crime researchers debate constantly. Is this a case that modern forensics simply hasn't gotten to yet, waiting for one more advancement in DNA technology? Or is this a case where too much time, too much handling, and too much contamination has already destroyed the possibility of ever getting a definitive answer? Nobody currently knows the answer to that question, not officially, not yet. And for the families of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, the 2 teenagers whose first date began this entire 50-plus year saga, that uncertainty isn't an abstract debate. It's the reality they've lived with for over half a century. More than 50 years have passed since December 20th, 1968. If they had lived, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen would be in their 70s today. Grandparents, perhaps, with careers behind them and decades of ordinary life that were never allowed to happen. Instead, their names occupy a strange, specific place in American true crime history, the first confirmed victims of a killer who was never caught, whose case became so culturally enormous that the victims themselves are sometimes an afterthought in a story that grew far bigger than either of them. For the town of Benicia and neighboring Vallejo, the case never fully closed, not practically and not emotionally. Lake Herman Road remains a place tied permanently to that night. Local historians, journalists, and true crime researchers still mark the anniversary. In 2018, on the 50th anniversary of the murders, retrospectives ran across Bay Area media, revisiting a case that refuses to fade. For the broader true crime community, the Zodiac case became something close to a cultural institution. The subject of David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac, Robert Graysmith's best-selling books, countless documentaries, podcasts, and amateur cipher-solving communities that persist online to this day, but strip away the pop culture, the movies, the decades of theorizing, and what remains is simpler and far sadder. 2 teenagers went on a first date. They kept none of the promises they made that night, not because they broke them, but because someone else made that choice for them. Their case never received the ending most true crime stories eventually offer: an arrest, a trial, a name spoken in a courtroom. Vallejo PD and the FBI both still list the Zodiac case as officially open. Somewhere, potentially, the truth about who killed David and Betty Lou still exists, in DNA too degraded to fully test, in a name nobody has definitively confirmed, or possibly in a person who died decades ago, having never been publicly connected to any of it. 50-plus years later, the question that started this entire case remains exactly as unanswered as it was the night Stella Borges' headlights caught two bodies on a quiet gravel turnout. Who did this? And will anyone ever really know for certain? Go back for a moment to where we started this video, a car door creaking open in the dark. 5 gunshots. A girl running, but not making it far enough. That moment, brutal, sudden, over in less than 2 minutes, became the opening scene of one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. Not because of anything mysterious about the crime itself, but because of everything that came after it. The letters, the ciphers, the decades of obsessed investigators, the suspects who were never confirmed, and a killer who, as far as we officially know, was never caught. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen weren't chasing infamy. They were 2 teenagers on a first date, keeping a simple promise to be home by 11 p.m. That promise is the last ordinary thing either of them ever did. More than 50 years later, their case remains open, officially, actively, which means, somewhere, the truth about that night might still exist, waiting for the right piece of evidence, the right advance in forensic science, or simply the right person willing to keep looking. So I'll leave you with the same question investigators have been asking since 1968. Do you think the Zodiac's identity will ever be confirmed? Or is this a mystery that will outlive all of us? Let me know your theory in the comments. And if you want to see the full story of what happened 7 months later at Blue Rock Springs, or how the Zodiac ciphers were finally cracked decades later, subscribe, because that's exactly what we're covering next on this channel.